Welcome to Still Untitled, the Adam Savage Project. I'm Norm.
I'm Adam.
I'm Kate.
Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
How's it going?
It's going pretty okay. I mean, not much has been going on with me lately.
I wanted to start by celebrating a lovely thing that happened. The new issue of Cinefex came out, and it includes an article on Solo, the Han Solo film, and in it is a model maker's dream, which is Kayte Sabicer is in a picture working on one of the dejarik chess pieces from Solo.
Mr. Big is in my hands.
That's like a rite of passage for filmmakers and people who work in the effects business, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Well, and it's always great when it's a complete surprise. Basically, I always said, I want to look at this new Cinefex. It just came out, and you said, I have a copy.
Did you have no rumblings at all? No.
I thought, I just want to see who they covered. I had no expectations about myself.
I think you said you might know some people who work there. Because you have friends who work at Lucas.
Yeah. It was just me looking through the pictures, and I just audibly just started screeching. Everyone goes, "Are you okay? What happened?
Well, when I came in yesterday, you were holding it up like you're holding up. I got a secret. And this is not your first time in Cinefex.
Actually, it is not. No, I had another surprise one while I was working on the Tumblr for Dark Knight Rises. There is a photo of my friend Jonathan and I both hard at work on it, but I like this picture better.
Yeah,
I mean, thinking it from a editorial perspective, the magazine, lots of text. If you've never picked up a Cinefex, it's an interesting form factor. I think these days they cover maybe 4 or 5 films per issue. Mm-hmm. They go to deep dives, and you have your before after VFX shots. They love the green screen and what it looks like before and after, celebrating the people in that department. But they also love photos of people working on the practical effects. Because
I literally grew up on Cinefex looking at people, and then later on having the wonderful grace to work with and for some of those people that I grew up seeing in the pages of Cinefex.
Yeah, it's such a great way to form your idols and actually even be informed of this process. Because, I mean, as a kid, it's not always straightforward. I wasn't aware that model making was a thing until you start to see these behind the scenes. Or if you've ever seen Movie Magic, the old TV show, there's an episode with Phil Tippett on that one that just changed my life. So this was that. It was very, very cool.
Well, it gives you a sense of the scale of miniatures and how the things that you see on a big screen actually looked in person.
Yeah. Well, you're holding on to Mr. Big, and he looks pretty complete. But are you doing the model shop reach in that photo?
Okay, I was just about to say, I am very proud to say that I 100% was working on him at that moment. I think I was tightening his knee joint because he actually has a gorgeous, gorgeous armature, ball and socket, fully machined by Brett Foxwell, who's just a super talented machinist.
He's done work with me here in the shop.
Yeah, he's great. And so somebody actually came in while I happened to be working on him. So it was not the fake, just, act like you're pointing at something and just smile. I was working on him.
There's an early Cinefex, and I can't remember what movie it is in, but somebody at ILM is working on a Rebel cruiser, and they're holding in their hands a rivet gun and a blowtorch. Here's something about Cinefex that I'm going to say, I think publicly for maybe the first time I've ever seen, which is as big blockbusters. So Cinefex comes out quarterly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So some of the movies it's covering have already come out. Some of them are about to come out, and some of them are maybe a month or more away from coming out. That's fairly regular. Mm-hmm. And the movies it covers are often some of the biggest effects-driven movies, which means it's the tentpole films of those studios. And those tentpole films, as you and I have talked about on the podcast many times, have whole mini industries until the films come out, analyzing the trailers and what the plot will be and what the points will be and who the villain is and what these scenes will be. And yet Cinefex comes out and chronicles the entire plot of the movies that it covers. The spoilers in Cinefex are so egregious. It literally, I can't believe that, well, now I'm saying it for the first time. Websites that are interested in film spoilers of upcoming tentpole blockbusters, go get yourself some Cinefex because they're all there.
Right. It's like, don't know how it gets past the marketing, but good for them. It's same with some of the art books.
Maybe we've just ruined it.
Oh,
Well, no,
The secret's out. The secret's out.
It's because they're based in the UK. They can get away with it. Maybe. I don't know. But even when you look at the art books, the story of how films get made, we sometimes get behind the scenes stories with directors' interviews, commentary, but sometimes the authors, like the journalists at Cinefex or the people writing the art books, the exposure they get to the film is in that moment of time, and it may be different. Like they'll tell stories of scenes that we never see,
Right.
Because they were deleted scenes
True.
or characters that they saw an effect that was being worked on that never made the film. So you
Right.
get wonderful stories behind the movies as well.
Also, Cinefex, we've talked about it on the podcast, but it's been a few years. You can now buy Cinefex digitally,
Yes.
and you can buy access to their entire back catalog digitally. And as you know, Cinefex is a PhD college education in the history of 20th century special effects. It is not a cursory dive. And even though films now are far more CG based than they are in the practical, when it was in the practical, you would hear them say, "Oh, I use this great 2-part self-skinning foam that BJB just came out with,
Right.
and I utilized it, but it wasn't right, so we had to bring in this chemist from the military who knew rubbers in order to..." This is in the Alien 3, talking about the deep chemistry of the rubbers used to cast the alien's suit. And even now
love
they
that.
talk specifically about, "Oh, we custom designed 5 shaders, and then we found some guy in Tacoma who built the 6th, and that helped us make the apes."
Right?
Well, it turns out for the people who work in those films, you people, right? You
Yeah,
guys, no one gets to ask you those questions. You never get a chance to tell those stories unless
Totally.
it's from these outlets.
I mean, just imagine reading an auto magazine where they're like, "Well, it turned out a different kind of mesh worked for the oil filter. And so with some grade 8 bolts and a blowtorch, I was able to," right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
The most, as specific as you can possibly imagine, that's where Cinefex goes.
Well, and I've encountered a lot of people in the industry who treat things like trade secrets too. So sometimes you'll work with people who have great knowledge and insight, but you don't get access to any of that because they don't want to share it. So sometimes this is a way of getting in there and feeling like you're hearing the secrets.
Well, it's
Exactly.
straddling that fine line of a trade publication, which it kind of is.
Right.
It's for people who work in the
yeah.
industry, and something that can still appeal to the mass market. Because if you watch, Avengers or Solo, and I think you're educated enough at this point, and I think a lot of what we do on Tested follows the model of what Cinefex has been doing for so many years, decades.
Well, and you're somewhat educated, but boy, sitting and reading through an entire article of Cinefex it's a deep dive. And
you're
it's
not
deeper
afraid.
than you
Oh,
think.
yeah.
You're not afraid to have it all out there.
Yeah.
Not at all. I a few years ago, I successfully completed a complete set of Cinefex.
Whoa.
And it started with maybe the greatest Craigslist find ever, which is, I guess this is probably now about 10, 12 years ago. I do a lot of regular eBay searches, but every now and then I port my eBay searches over to Craigslist, and most of the time I don't find stuff. But if you can, I found someone selling Cinefex issues 1 through 15 for like $250.
Wow. I know that sounds like a lot.
That sounds like
but
a lot.
If you have
Oh,
that eBay
oh,
search,
yeah.
there's lots.
Yeah.
There are regular holes in the lots because there are definitely certain issues, especially the early ones, are very difficult to find.
Oh,
the
yeah.
Blade Runner issue? That Blade Runner issue is expensive if you can find it.
Actually, someone the other day just said to me, "Oh, one day I was walking down the street and I just found a box of those magazines that you were just talking about. Like tons of them. Not recent though. They were all the old ones from the 70s and 80s. And I was just like, where are they?"
Actually, as an aside, Freddie's over at my storage space. I'll have to find it. When I completed my collection, I ended up with a bunch of doubles because I had to buy some lots.
Whoa.
I'll bring in my doubles later on this week so you guys can sift through them and have them, because I
Rouse.
think I have about 30 issues that are doubled up.
Holy moly.
An office collection would be awesome.
I'll just take a vacation week, just look at Cinefex the whole time.
It really, way back before I was doing television, I worked for Lucasfilm, and they started to send me out to do public speaking on behalf of Lucasfilm. I mentioned to the PR department that I was potentially good at it, and in 2000 they sent me to the Breckenridge, Colorado Film Festival, and in this small auditorium, I built a slide deck with actual slides and a slide projector
my.
from Lucasfilm Archives, and I built a talk, and then I took questions from the audience. And I'm like a 30-year-old model maker, right? A 33-year-old model maker. And yet, because I had read every single episode of every single issue of Cinefex, I had this ability to put these pieces together for the audience to really help them understand the arc of how some of the effects that we're using today are still some of the oldest effects that anyone's used in film.
Yeah.
You were their guide through the process.
I was really surprised how much Cinefex prepared me for being able to talk about that.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So go get yourself a digital subscription to Cinefex.
Pick up that latest issue.
Yeah. Pick up that latest issue. Get Kate to autograph it.
Yeah.
Maybe I will.
What else is new, Adam?
Well,
what have you
speaking
been
of
working on?
autographs, we had quite a renowned guest in the shop yesterday, and I tweeted about it, and he Instagrammed about it. We had Jack White of the White Stripes fame, maker extraordinaire, an upholsterer, and all-around maker, enthusiast, and wonderful patron of design.
Yes.
He has beautiful Third Man Records in Nashville and in Detroit. He's working on another space in another city we were talking about yesterday. But he came by with a couple of his crew and hung out with us for a couple hours.
It was a lovely day.
You hadn't seen him since you did that video with him at Third Man Records?
I think, yeah. So Tested went to Third Man Records and recorded last year's premium members gift there in their studio, cut it on an actual record lathe and printed it in their facility.
Yeah.
That was, I think, the last time I'd seen him.
I don't know if you can tell us. You relayed a story of lessons you learned there paying off in things you were doing on Mythbusters Junior.
Wait, explain.
The microphone.
Oh, yes. No, so we did an episode on Mythbusters Junior about sound, and I wanted the audience to have as physical a connection to the chain of recording sound that we had on the show. And I was able to use a microphone that I learned about in Third Man, which was a ribbon microphone, which is this absolutely infinitesimally thin ribbon of metal used to transmit the signal of sound into the recording device. And we used that on the Third Man recording, and I used it on Mythbusters Junior.
That was awesome. I could tell he was pleased that bit came to fruition.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's great about Jack is the people around him they're all just as geeky and just as deeply invested in the product and the making and the process as he is, and that's our connection as makers.
He without going into specific what you guys are talking about, his people definitely acknowledge that when you were talking, it brings out his obsessions.
Oh, really?
And it brings out, like, you guys converse so naturally. They were learning things that they did not know he knew.
Oh, cool.
Like, they were like, oh, we didn't know he was interested in that and this and that. And it just came naturally in that conversation.
I was pleasantly surprised. He mentioned he is sort of a connoisseur of old photo booths. Mm-hmm. And I have a deep interest, but my knowledge is seriously lacking. But he talked about a booth he has that just sounds perfectly amazing to me. And it like prints out the actual old photo in the frame with the old process, like from the 1930s, I want to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's a famous photo of Robert Johnson with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and what Jack told us was that was taken in this very specific type of photo booth that he's got one of the earliest examples of and has it up and running.
Oh, that is amazing. I would love to see that someday.
Just a delightful visit from an awesome maker, and
Yes.
I got to sit backstage and watch him perform last night. It was really that's also awesome. Like, talk to a maker and then go watch him hold court at the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium for an incredibly wonderful, grateful crowd. And holy hell, do he and his band put on a show!
Now
Is this going up today?
No, a couple days later.
All right, sorry. The concert's already happened in the past.
Yeah.
You lose.
They utilize the new process at their shows, right? Where they make you put your cell phone in a magnetic bag.
Oh.
Yep.
Okay.
And so while you're in the venue, you cannot access your phone. But if you go out into the hallway, you can unlock it and access your phone.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Jack talked extensively about how much better that made the shows.
at that point,
without people sitting there holding this up. He said people would come up to him after the show and be like, "Oh, I got to know my neighbors,
Yeah.
and we all danced together. I felt so much more present."
The engagement level
Yeah.
is really there. He said the biggest problem was people didn't know what time it was because nobody wears a watch.
it's like a casino. You don't need to know what time.
no.
Just be in the moment.
You're
Enjoy.
there.
As long
You're
as the
there.
set changes are on time.
Yep.
And no one's just lingering for 45 minutes. It's all good.
And when you watch him on stage, it's really clear he prizes that connection with the audience. As a performer and storyteller, he wants to be with them, and he wants to close that gap.
Yes.
And it's beautiful to watch that happen. And it's whole band. I mean, everyone. I wrote this morning and said my crew had hearts coming out of their eyes after you guys left, and he said mine too. Yeah, it's lovely. I love cross-disciplining and talking to people who are good at what they do in ways that are very different than mine, because I
Yes.
feel like there's always commonalities when you've gone down the path of trying to be excellent at something.
Totally.
Hey everybody, before we continue on this week's episode, I want to thank the sponsor of Still Entitled this week, and that is NFL Podcasts. Are you smarter or more devoted than the average NFL fan? Well, be sure to catch the Move the Sticks podcast, hosted by former NFL scouts Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks. Jeremiah and Brooks break down the most impressive performances of the week, explaining how individual players and teams are able to be successful based on their skill sets, techniques, and coaching decisions. The Move the Sticks podcast provides detailed analysis of the college and pro game from seasoned experts. From the NFL Combine straight through to Super Bowl, there's no offseason on the Move the Sticks podcast. With guests like NFL GMs, head coaches, and top draft prospects, no one brings you closer to the inner workings of football than Move the Sticks podcast. Subscribe now to Move the Sticks podcast, with new episodes dropping 3 times a week, available on your favorite podcast app or NFL.com. Again, that's Move the Sticks podcast, and thank them for sponsoring this week's episode. Back to the conversation.
That's something you're in the process of doing right now in the research.
Well, I'm working on the book.
Yeah.
So I'm working on I don't know if we're revealing the title just yet, so I won't reveal the title, but I'm working on a book about things I've learned in my life of making, and I'm interviewing a lot of wonderful people for this. And so initially we broke out all these chapters, and I figured, well, this person's interview would be good for this chapter, and this person's interview would be good for that chapter. And I threw almost all of that specificity out, because as I'm talking to these makers, the conversations are ranging so far and wide. It's like we're talking about failure, we're talking about iteration, we're talking about workshop and workplace design, we're talking about frustration, all those things that we have to get past to make anything. And I mean making in, obviously, as I've said, dance, poetry, screwing caps onto toothpaste tubes, if that's your kink.
Yep.
Some of these people you have long, great relationships with. Some are new friends of yours. Is it just as easy to jump into a conversation? Do you prompt them? Like, how do you get them to jive in that moment?
So interviewing people is something I've done a lot of. I did it on the Talking Room. I do it here at City Arts and Lectures, and in San Francisco at the Commonwealth Club. And it's never easy for me. I always find interviewing to be stressful, because I want to have another question right away. And as people are talking, I'm coming up with other questions. So I'm furiously writing while trying to listen,
Right.
while trying to think of the next question, because my terror is they'll finish and I'll go, cool.
And that 3 seconds will feel like an eternity.
An absolute eternity. And they're just thinking, what an idiot. This book, however, it is talking about my favorite subject, about making stuff. And I'm not an expert in anything in any specific thing that I do, but I think I am an expert in thinking about the box that it all goes in from a creative and execution standpoint. And I love learning from other people about what their process is like.
Totally. I love to surround myself with people who know things I don't, because I can only gain things from that relationship.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And hopefully it'll be a two-way street.
So let me ask you, Kate. Here's a question I've been asking everybody for the book.
Okay.
What was your first shop? What was your first shop like?
My first shop, professionally, because I grew up with both of my grandfathers were carpenters,
Oh.
and my dad wasn't necessarily a carpenter, but I was a tomboy, so I spent my evenings and weekends with him in the garage and building clubhouses and birdhouses and anything I could, ramps for RC cars and just all that. So that was my shop. That was my house. That's where I like to be.
You've always had access to a makerspace.
Yes.
Okay,
And-
so then the first shop that you set up for yourself, either in an apartment or on a desk or...
That would have been, I got my first house, and I turned the garage into, I do stained glass as well on the side. And so I custom built a workbench that would be just the right height for me to stand at. I measured okay, if I reach this far, because I need to be able to put the right amount of pressure for a cut.
Yeah.
And I surfaced it. I noticed that you had a worktop like this as well, with this layer of plastic material.
Self-healing.
Yes, so that as the glass would slip and gouge the surface, it wouldn't create anything sharp that would scratch the next round. And if it got too uneven, I could iron it smooth. So it was just all about making this space work exactly for me. And it got to a point where that desk was no longer viable anymore. I came up with new solutions.
Well, why was it no longer viable?
Basically-
Did you wear it out or did your techniques change?
My techniques changed, and I built it for how I thought I was going to use it. And then as I used it, I discovered, it would be better if it were longer this way, or if it wasn't as deep. I noticed I made it a little too deep. One side of it wasn't being utilized enough, so I started redesigning.
It's funny, as you said, I made it just deep enough, and I thought, oh, this measurement is easy with a tape measure. You can put your
Yeah.
arm out and going, yeah, that's comfortable. But this one, I've gotten that. My welding table there is too deep, and I've
Okay.
been thinking, the top weighs like 200 pounds. And it's so tiring to think about changing that. I've toyed with just plasma cutting off the front foot. But yeah, depth of a workbench is really,
Right?
really important.
And then I ended up moving away from stained glass a little more, and I set up, I started renting a studio space closer to where I work and everything, and I got an amazing drafting table from Phil Tippett. He was like, here, take this. And as his daughter described it, it's pre-stained with red wine and frustration. So it was exactly everything I wanted. So now, and by then I knew exactly what I needed. I needed storage for this. I needed ways to store glue and paint. So it was a great that by the time I did that, I had learned all the things I needed.
That's that process of watching the watcher, of monitoring your own usage patterns. It's constantly ongoing, isn't it?
It is 100%. Every time I think I get a handle on it, I mean, I'm sure you see that because I'm seeing you. I come in and I go, oh, this shop is perfect and it's perfectly organized. And yet I'll come in days and you'll have changed a bunch of things. And I'm thought, well, that wasn't necessary, was it? Until I go, oh, no, this is much better. I didn't even know it could be better.
It's all informed by the work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The work has a mind of its own.
And taking that time to, like, when people say, what do you do when you can't think of what to make? And I'm like, I make a new sorter.
Yeah.
I start adjusting the shop to myself. There's always, I don't care whether it's a shop at NASA, there's a shelf full of shit that you haven't dealt with.
Always.
There is, the hardest part about categorizing stuff in a shop are the one-offs.
Right.
Like
right.
a friend of mine was telling me, I introduced him to the idea of a strip heater for acrylic. And he didn't know about it, so he bought one. Now it's in his shop, and he's like, I don't know where it goes. I don't have
it
any
doesn't
other
fall in the
acrylic working
category.
tools in my shop.
Yeah.
So I have no idea where it should go. Maybe we need some more acrylic tools. Clearly, we need a shelf. But you can't, because if it's a one-off and you get clever, you could put it somewhere and not see it for 20 years because you can't remember where you
You're
put
gonna
it.
forget all about it. And that's the other thing that I like is, and I'm sure you've done this a lot, is you find one tool or one new material that gets you excited, and then that inspires you to build your collection of tools, and then all of a sudden you have a storage issue or an organization issue that you didn't need to think about before. You're like, well, I didn't have any acrylic stuff, so now I have to reimagine the whole shop.
So that I was showing you this morning, I made a new leather working toolbox out of some makeup cases, and that was because I've been slowly gathering more leather working tools, and I had them in one part of a drawer, and then I had them in their own little drawer, and then I had them in their own little case, and now it's like now when I was pulling stuff from 4 different drawers to do any leather working, and it was like at a certain point I reached this tipping point where it was time to just make a toolbox.
Critical
for it.
mass. All right, it gets its own category.
F drawers. Toolboxes.
Yes, exactly. So we should do a tested piece on this one toolbox because my solution to drawers is to make them all clear so you can see everything inside of them.
And I love
beautiful.
it. I love it.
yeah.
Isn't
It
that
changed
great?
my life. I never thought about it.
And where do you get clear drawers? Freezer drawers, which are made of high impact, very thermally stable plastic, or makeup storage,
Right.
which you can get on Amazon for pennies out of acrylic. They're sold all over. I mean, even in the dollar store, you can go find makeup sorters that are clear plastic. For some reason, within makeup, everything's clear plastic.
I'm not quite sure I understand why that is, because then it just looks like a mess. But whatever.
But for modelers, that's
it's great.
fantastic.
Yeah.
You
Giving
don't
yourself
lose a
X-ray
file.
vision.
Yes.
And the thing about freezer drawers, like that's a great thing. We have a local place called Urban Ore, which is great. It's essentially old junk. You can get piles of used windows and old appliances. And so I just imagine you could go there and get freezer drawers that everybody else is grossed out by. You're like, I know what I can do with this.
I'll bet there's a whole canvas bin of freezer drawers at Urban Ore.
I will find out.
I have been shopping at Urban Ore for 30 years. I will tell you, I was working at Berkeley Rep in 1992, and my friend Michael Frasinelli brought in an opaque projector. You know what that is?
I believe so.
So it's a reflective projector. So you can put a piece of magazine art in it and project it on a
Yes,
wall
yes,
of any
yes,
size.
yes, yes.
And so for model making, it can be just transferring something from this to a wall
Yes.
can be really
I've done that
complicated.
many times. It's so helpful.
So opaque projectors are expensive. Used ones start at like $150, and they're dumbly expensive.
They are.
So Michael Frasinelli brought in this opaque projector. It was old and beautiful. And I was like, where did you get that? And he's like, Urban Ore. And I'm like, no way, do they have another one? And he's like, they have two more. One of them is missing a lens, and the other one has the lens. So maybe you can get them to sell you both for a deal, something like that.
Yeah.
So I go in and I'm like, do you guys have any opaque projectors? And the guy goes, no. And I'm like, no, I happen to know that you have them and they're upstairs. And he's like, I don't think so. And I'm like, no, my friend was just here the other day. And he goes, all right. And he walks me upstairs. And there's these two opaque projectors. And he goes, I can't sell you either of these. This one doesn't have a lens. And I'm like, no, but you could take the lens out of this one and sell that one to me. And he goes, no, it doesn't have a lens. And I said, my friend told me it didn't have a lens. And then he looks at me and he goes, did your friend steal the lens? And I'm like, okay, this has gotten way farther than I thought it was going.
You're like, can I please just buy these for you?
I'm just going to go now.
Take my money.
I don't know how this escalated so quickly.
Did you get the projectors?
No. In the end, my father had one and he gave it to me. And I still have it. It's here in the shop.
I had a great one from my grandfather, same thing, where he was like, you do art, maybe you can use this. And I loved it, but I noticed that it was a little terrifying because of the bulb that it was
It's
using.
like a 150-watt bulb
Yeah.
in a metal box.
Oh yeah, like any piece of paper or whatever you put in there, like you had to make sure it wasn't gonna like catch on fire.
Well,
it
it's
would
an easy
start
bake
to,
oven.
Oh yeah, it would start to curl for sure. Like you had to keep a firm eye on that and unplug it as soon as you were done.
But just in case this sounds like a primitive tool, we used this exactly that tool, an opaque projector, to transfer blueprint drawings on Star Wars from the set to making miniatures that were 6 feet tall.
That's perfect. Yeah. We used to do that. I went to a specialty fine arts high school, and so we were constantly having to do paintings and especially paint from photographs. And so we would we had a hallway, you would just set up your photograph there and project it all the way on the wall, whatever size you needed, and go from there.
My dad's technique, and he did a lot of painting from photographs. He liked using, I get the idea he liked using other people's, sorry, the word escapes me. Wow.
Composition?
No. Just the
silhouette?
formal layout. He
Okay.
just
Okay.
and he liked using other people's aesthetic layout and then
Okay.
working on his own color and distribution in there. He would take a picture with a film camera, have it developed as a slide, put it in a slide projector, project the slide.
Perfect.
Which is now that would be harder because I don't know where you go to get slides developed.
Right,
But
right.
back then that was a fairly quick process. It was like a one or 2 day turnaround.
Right. That's
very
very
cool.
clever.
I'm still trying to think of the actual word I was thinking of. I know you're probably yelling it at the screen at the podcast right now. What else is going on, Norm?
This week on the site, as the podcast is coming out, we are finally able to release a video that we shot back in Weta Workshop with you and our friend Johnny Fraser Allen. And
I love Johnny so much.
When we went to Weta now 2 years ago, he showed us. He was just a guy in their sculpting department, and I think they were working on Ghost in the Shell at that point. We were doing interviews there. He goes, "Oh, I want to show you something, Adam." And he had this thing just in their sculpting. It's a room, like this is their physical sculpting department. And in the back of the room, he pulled out this maze. And right around that time is right after you had finished your hedge maze for The Shining. And this was a miniature maze that Johnny had made for the board game Labyrinth. It was the Labyrinth Maze.
Whoa.
And he built this. It was maybe like 4 feet by 4 feet maze. With pieces that interlocked, and it's for tabletop gaming.
Okay.
Very impressive. We did an interview. The people loved it. And then when we went back this year, that maze had grown.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And
So, I mean, to say that it had grown is an understatement.
it is, we pull back in the video, you'll see, and it is now 4 feet by like 20 feet. And it is a landscape, and it's a whole tabletop world he's made. And the idea is that he's now turning this into kind of he modeled it all and 3D printed a bunch of it, painted it all. What did we learn? We learned that he used like house paints for a lot of this stuff because they're cheap.
Yeah.
Cheaper than model making paint, house paint. And now he's launching a crowdfunding campaign because these are going to be manufactured kits for people.
Wait, for the full 20-foot long
I think
one?
in various themes, like
you
a
could buy
forest,
pizzas and
Oh,
parts
you
and
can
things, like model
build-
trains.
and castles and villages, and some of the engineering he did that because it's all for gaming, right?
Right,
And you gotta
right.
rebuild your village every time you do it. They're all stackable. If you want it to be a tower, you put 4 pieces together and it looks like a tower.
cool.
If you take the top of that and put it on the ground, it's a hut.
And-
John, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask, is this limited still to just the Labyrinth
I think
game,
it's
or
just
can it be
fantasy theme. Like he had
That's-
littered with small figures from all manner of tabletop.
That's great. So it's super versatile.
Yeah.
So even if you play a different kind of game, this is still something that
Yeah.
you can get into.
Johnny is one of those people who, when you ask him about his process and about his work, his eyes get this glow. And he gets this tone in his voice, and you're surfing his enthusiasm as he tells you about it.
Yeah.
I definitely respond to that in people. I just like to stand back and be like, you are doing exactly what you need to be doing right now.
And it's invigorating and inspiring to be around that kind of energy.
Definitely.
That's what it feels like to walk through the halls of Weta, actually.
Yeah, and this is like their 10% time. This is like their stuff he's not even doing for work.
Right.
He's just doing on his own. Yeah, amazing stuff. And I think we have a one-day build coming out with you and Laura Kampf.
Oh!
Yes, she was over here back.
I didn't realize that hadn't come out yet.
It's been busy, but I think she'll actually be in town.
I believe we might be
Yeah.
slated to do another one-day build later on this month.
Yeah.
She's
Laura,
fantastic.
She's amazing.
That was my first time meeting her, and I'm over the moon. Definitely a fan.
Yeah.
So lots of things to look forward to. And if you haven't checked it out, we have a new contributor on our team, Daryl Maloney. And his first project was 3D printing and a helmet for you, Adam. And he goes through it's 100+ hours of printing. So it's
He's been
His-
sending
lot of
me updates, and I'm so glad that Daryl is on the team because he's so prolific. I said this in the tweet. He makes me a little jealous of how much he turns around.
Right? His helmets and masks are mind blowing. Yeah, I just can't believe it. And they're so complex. And have you seen when he posts something where it's like, oh, I got 50 hours in and then it failed?
Yeah.
And you're like, no,
Yeah, exactly.
I wasn't even involved, but I'm very upset right now.
I can imagine that, like, if you stayed in his house, in his guest room, you'd just be hearing all night long the sound of...
it's a song, right? The songs of the machine.
Yes.
Some friends of mine were given for their wedding a bread maker, which sounded like the coolest thing in the world. But what the bread maker does is it mixes and rises the dough itself all autonomously. And they thought that sounded great until the middle of the first night they ran the bread machine. They turned it on, and they, like 3 hours later, they're woken up to this this terrible sound.
Yes, my mom used to use a bread maker, and it was a weird experience.
It's an
for sure.
impressive, weird, because you wake
Yes.
up in the middle and you're like, I don't know what that could be.
Yeah.
It's a Foley artist's dream.
It sounds
or nightmare.
At times, it can sound like an unbalanced washing machine too, where you're just like something is slamming around. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to end. Yeah.
It's a fairly quiet, still Untitled
Yes.
today.
Yeah.
Thank you so
cover
much
a
for
couple
joining us, Kate.
things.
Thank you. Yeah. I
Yes.
always love being here.
Yeah,
Always lovely to have
We're
you
gonna
on.
get back to the shop and get some projects done, which you'll see in the future.
All right, guys.
All right. Bye.
See you next week.